Alright, let's get into what an API is. First of all, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and you're probably wondering, why do we have a McDonald's on the screen? Well, I'm going to use an example of ordering from McDonald's to compare UI automation versus API automation. So stick around and let's take a look at how it relates to McDonald's. So, looking at the McDonald's example, let's say we have a user called UiBob. Bob is your traditional UI automation, automating the actual user interface of an application. In this example, Bob will go into the store and order a meal from McDonald's. Then we have API Mary. API Mary is going to be pre-ordering McDonald's at home using the application, paying at home, and then simply going through the drive-thru to pick up her McDonald's. So let's take a look at how these compare. First of all, Bob has to go into the store. He walks into the store and then he hasn't thought about what he wants. He has to look at the menu and decide what he wants to order. He has to then line up and place his order. Once he's placed his order, he has to wait for the meal to cook. So he's standing around the McDonald's waiting for the meal to cook. Then we've got API Mary at home. API Mary decides she's hungry. I could sure go for some Macca's, which is McDonald's in Australialand. She opens up the McDonald's app, she pre-orders on her phone and pays on her phone. Then all she needs to do is go through drive-thru and pick it up and go home. Since she pre-ordered on the app, it was ready on arrival. So Mary's already at home eating a McDonald's. Unfortunately for UiBob, his McDonald's took a bit longer to cook than expected. It took up to 10 minutes. So he finally leaves the store and goes home and enjoys his McDonald's. So we can see in this example, API Mary was much more faster, easier, and more convenient. So let's take a look at how this analogy applies to RPA, and then we'll take a look at why you don't always want to use API automation and cases where you will want to use API automation. So bringing it back together, let's take an example of automating Salesforce. UiBob would automate the actual user interface of the application, which would save and read data to the database. Whereas API Mary would use an API interface, which would also save and read data from the database. So given it was much more convenient for Mary to order McDonald's, why don't we always use APIs? First of all, they're not always available. Not every application supports an API interface, which is why RPA is so powerful in that it can tie many different applications together, not just those that have APIs only. Fear of the unknown. Some departments are scared of APIs. It sounds like a big word. It brings up images of the IT department. It's their responsibility. We don't want to be IT. We're just saving money for the business. I don't think that's a valid reason in my mind. I think that can be addressed over time by education and actually understanding where it does come into use and what it is good for. We don't always have the skill set. You might have a small team who doesn't have the skill set for API automation, in which case that's completely fine to use a UI automation as normal. Sometimes it is more upfront setup time to actually use an API to automate an application such as Salesforce rather than use a UI automation. And it's just another thing to maintain on top of everything else. So now you need to know how to understand API automations as well. And finally, it can be difficult to get approval or access to. Some APIs you can access straight away, but others actually will require approval from the product owner, from Salesforce, ServiceNow, and any other product at all. And sometimes it's quite a difficult process to get approval. So that's why it can be easier just to automate it at the actual user interface level, as if a user was interacting with the application. So hopefully I haven't scared you off by now. So when should we actually think about using an API? Save on licensing costs. One that tremendously sticks out in my mind is we had a process which would take up to 15 minutes to actually process one item. Converting this over to use an API for the application, which will ServiceNow, reduce that time from processing one item from 15 minutes to 1 second at most. That is a tremendous time saving. And you might be thinking, well, okay, cool, we're saving a lot of time. What if that bot is processing 50 items per day? Using UI automation, if that takes 15 minutes, that's going to take 12.5 hours every day to process all the items. Whereas if you're using API automation, it's going to take 50 seconds, less than a minute, to process all those items. Let's just say your licensing costs are at $100 per hour. So to run the bot for 1 day using UI automation at $100 per hour at 12.5 hours would cost $1,250. Whereas API automation, taking 50 seconds would cost you 60 cents, nothing at all. So imagine that over the course of a year. Would you rather spend $1,250 every day or 60 cents? You can really see the business case here when you do have a more mature RPA function within an organization to actually evaluate new processes and also existing processes to move them over using API automation. Next one is your app is a SaaS product, which is software as a service. For example, Salesforce, ServiceNow, etc. Many of these apps will actually update every 6 months, and the customer doesn't always have a choice whether or not they update. They just get it immediately without a warning at all. So when you get this update, usually your bot's already doing UI automation break because a user interface update. Because of this, you have angry users calling you up, wanting the bot to work. They have to go back to manual processing. You've got pressure on you from your leadership to actually update the bot, which can take 1 or 3 days to actually update on average. And you might be working a weekend to update it every time Salesforce, ServiceNow decides to put out an update. This isn't fun at all. And while this might work if you're only maintaining one bot, as you maintain more bots, such as 10 bots, 50 bots, it simply becomes unfeasible to do this. The great thing is, many of these SaaS products also support APIs for any interaction you do at all. And these APIs are stable. They don't change them, and if they do, they usually give their customers at least a year's warning. And the APIs will typically remain exactly the same for anywhere from 3 to 5 years without updating at all. So once you've actually set up a bot to use API automation on one of these SaaS products instead of UI automation, it will simply work and you won't have to do any updates at all to it for around 3 to 5 years. Whereas every 6 months, it's just very frustrating and a tedious process. And using this will also save on the licensing costs, as we saw above, because it runs a lot faster. Next reason you should think about using an API is to avoid website automation. Websites, as you've probably seen if you've automated quite a few of them, they update all the time, they don't always work, you have to have retries in your bot, and they're just very painful to automate. So if it does support an API on the particular website you're using, you should think about doing that instead of UI automation on the website. Next reason is your app only supports API automation. Well, you have no choice to use it. One example is a lot of cloud services such as Google Machine Learning only support API automation once it's set up to actually classify something. So you might be doing machine learning with Pokemon if you haven't checked out my video on doing this in UiPath to detect what Pokemon a user uploaded, and you can only do this through API automation as an example. And finally, wanting to learn it. This is a really good case to use API automation. I recommend trying out a trial bot at first, something that's really small, does a simple task to actually learn about API automation, and I really recommend it if you haven't already. So now that you know what API automation is, smash that like button to confirm that you know what it is. It will really help out the channel and help spread the message to other RPA developers to learn about what API automation actually is, when you shouldn't use it, when you should use it. So remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.